Hey guys, Vinny here again. Now I'd like to walk through using an Ansible Playbook to create a project and all of the necessary steps involved that enable networking and everything for users to start consuming. The difference is I'm going to use the API using an Ansible URI module rather than the OpenStack clients. So I'll walk through what that means here in a minute. But first I'd just like to log into my environment, make sure that I am in the admin project, which I am. If I go over to Identity, I'll see I have a couple of projects that were created. Then I've got standard services and user. And then under users, again, all of the standard users plus a couple of users that were created for the environment. Okay, so we're going to come back to here and review this here in a minute. But what I'd like to do is just go ahead and do an Ansible Playbook Run. Now I'm going to use an OpenStack create project YAML, which I'll walk through here in a minute. But first I'd like to go ahead and demo it. So I'm just going to specify two variables. OS username, we'll call this Ansible demo, and then OS project is going to be the same. And that's it. So let's run through this, we'll watch it run, and then at the end we'll walk through what all of this means. And actually it doesn't take very long, so there we are, we're done. So if we scroll back through here, it's actually a little bit easier to kind of walk through the workflow if you look at the completed tasks rather than walking through the playbook. But what we can see here is that we're obtaining the admin token. So that means that I do have to have admin credentials because I want to create the user in the identity service and then create the project as well. So I'm obtaining a token first, and then I'm reusing that token throughout the rest of the playbook for the admin section at least. And then we do some extra steps here, and you'll see there's a lot of debugging that I have. Unless you've specified the debug variable, it's not going to dump anything, but that's pretty useful in case you do want to see the return values of the API responses. So we're verifying it. We're just setting some local facts for reusability. Then one of the things I'm doing is in an idempotent fashion, I want to make sure that I'm not trying to create objects that already exist. So we're checking for the project ID. If it does not exist, then we're going to create it, which you see happened here. Then we set it in a project ID fact. And then we just move on and repeat that. So we check for the user here. And then if it's not found, we create it. And then we just move on. So then we do the same thing. Well, we're not going to create the member role because we know that's created as part of the OpenStack deployment. But we are going to obtain the ID of the member role. And then we're going to obtain the ID of the admin role. And the reason for that is we're going to specify the member role for the user, but we're also going to add admin to the project. And I'm doing this in this demo just so that admin has direct access to all of the created projects. That way you don't have to log in and log out and see all the different projects. And then really the rest is just the standard workflow. We're going to go through and release the token. So what I'm going to actually do here is revoke the admin OpenStack token, and then I'm going to reobtain a token as the user. So that's pretty useful to be able to revoke the token and make sure it's not hanging around. So now, as the user that was just created for this project, now I'm going to go through and start checking my different objects. So I'm going to make sure that my specified security group exists. If you've specified default, that one will exist already. So that won't try to create it. And then we're going to go through and start checking our rules. So here we're checking to see if there's an SSH rule. So here what we're doing is we're actually obtaining the different rules as part of the security group retrieval earlier. And we're just iterating through this list and looking for the SSH rule. If we find it, we're going to set a local fact so that it doesn't get attempted again. And then we're doing the same thing for ICMP. And in this case, it was not found, so it was created. So an SSH rule was added and an ICMP rule was added. Then we're going to go through and discover the first external network. Now, because there are environments that can have multiple external networks and multiple subnets, you can explicitly specify those as variables. You can specify the network ID and the subnet ID to be used for the external network. But in this case, we're just going to iterate through what we found. Anything with the external router bit enabled will be looked at and the ID grabbed. And then we're going to go through and create the project network, the subnet, the router, and the router interface and so forth. And that's really the remainder of the playbook, and then we're going to revoke the user token. So let's verify and make sure it worked. Looks like it did, according to the playbook output. So if I refresh, there's our Ansible demo. We should see an Ansible demo user as well. And there we do. And if I go to admin and look at the networks, I should see the Ansible demo network. It did get assigned a CIDR, which is, there's a default in the playbook I'll look at in a minute. But let's go ahead and switch over to that. And now we see that in the drop-down. So let's just go straight to the project and fire up an instance, and then I'll look at the details of the playbook. Okay, so now I'm assuming at this point I've run the playbook as the admin because I need admin credentials to create the user and project, and then I've turned this environment over to somebody else. So I'm coming in as that somebody else, and the typical workflow fashion. The first thing I want to do is add my either create a key pair or add my existing public key. But in this case, I'm just going to use the Cirrus image, so I don't need that. So let's just do a test, and we'll do an image. And I don't need a key pair, so I'm not going to worry about that. And the Ansible demo network was created and selected, so we'll go ahead and use that. Now, since we're using the API, as I mentioned, we could spin up a test instance if we wanted to, but I didn't want to make that part of this playbook. That could be added on pretty trivially, though. And there we go. So let's go ahead and assign a floating IP. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if we can ping that. And we can. So we can SSH in. There we go. So we have the 192.168.0.5, which is what this guy is saying here. So there we go. We demonstrated that the playbook can enable everything needed in an environment for it to be working. One last thing I'd like to do before I go into the playbook itself is I'd like to show that I actually don't have any Nova commands installed on this system or any other OpenStack clients. So this is using pure API. So let's now take a look at that. Okay, so the playbook itself, I just have some variables hard-coded here at the beginning. This is a work in progress, so of course I would like to pull these out and put them into a separate either inventory or variable file. Since this is just actions done from localhost, we don't really need an inventory file. But either way, as you saw, I could pass in the extra variables and override. In this case, I do have this username hard-coded and project name, but I overrode those from the command line. So anything you set at the command line does get precedence when you call the playbook. But essentially, this is all the variables that you need to provide. So the controller in my case is hard-coded to a lab environment that I have, but that would be one variable you'd need to set. The admin auth URL, the regular user auth URL, and the networking URL. These should not need to be modified unless you're enabling HTTPS or you have different IPs for those different services. But in this case, just setting the controller IP, as you see here, would take that as a variable and fill those out. The project and username is probably almost always going to be admin, so you would just have to set the password. So for security purposes, you could put that into a variable file and use Ansible Vault to encrypt that, and then ask for your Ansible Vault password when you launch the playbook. That is documented elsewhere, but for this quick test, I just have this very simple password. Username, password, and project for the user are also needed. The security group, as I said, if you specify default, that's already there. You could also create a different security group if you wanted to. The only difference there is that when the user spawns an instance, they will have to select that additional security group. Okay, and then the network name, network subnet, and router names I just set to the project name. This can obviously be overridden if desired, but this is sufficient for purposes of just getting something up quickly. And the CIDR. Now, since we can have overlapping IPs, since we have isolated namespaces, this works just fine, but this could also be customized. Now, there is one issue I'd like to call out. When we look at the, as you see down here, the body format of the JSON payload that gets sent to the API, it's very, very particular. So technically what the API expects is a list of DNS servers, but I tried every method I knew within Ansible to define a list to pass to the API, and it does not like the way Ansible sends it. So I had to kind of implement this workaround here. So I'm just basically specifying DNS servers as individual strings, and then later on filling out the JSON data with those variables. And I'll get to that in a minute. But if you only had one DNS server, essentially later on in the code, you'd have to remove that second DNS server from being listed in the payload. Okay, so let's get on to it. What I decided to do was explore using the URI module within Ansible. That way I didn't need any clients. So theoretically, anywhere you have Ansible installed, you can use this approach. And in my case, I'm stuck using Ansible 1.9.x. We can't move to 2.0 yet. I know 2.0 and 2.1 have a nice set of OpenStack modules that you can use, OS Server and others. But for our uses and when this explicit project I'm working on, we can't do that. So up until now, we've been relying on OpenStack clients, but it's not the most efficient way to communicate with OpenStack in a programmatic level. Not only the fact that you have to authenticate on every single CLI command, but the output of the CLI commands are not JSON friendly. So you have to manipulate the data with using the shell module and then using awk and grep and other means to get to the data that you actually want. What's really nice about talking to the API directly is that I get JSON back and I can just refer to it directly within Ansible. So let's get going. So first here, we're just going to authenticate against the identity service. For admin, this is the payload data. Now this is very, very particular. It has to be in this exact format. This single tick has to be here on a line by itself. This opening curly brace for the dictionary has to be this many spaces over, and everything has to be spaced perfectly. And trust me, I have gone through as many possible iterations as I could possibly think of, and each one was rejected until I got to this particular standard here. Unfortunately, we couldn't use standard Ansible dictionaries. Even though the API received a JSON, it thought it was malformed. So in any case, this here does work. You can expand variables in here, and that works just fine. But essentially, we just register the output of that. We can easily just refer to that directly. So we don't have to manipulate the data through any additional means. The JSON is just there and contains what we need. So this is pretty much it. It's a repetitive set of tasks. Essentially, I'm hitting the API to look for the particular object name, in this case, the project, and I capture that if it's there, if the project name is defined. Now, since I'm querying an individual specific project, I do get back a list. That's why you see this 0 here. But it's going to be a list of one item if that project exists. Now, there is the remote possibility that we have two projects with the same name and two different IDs. So in this case, there would be a list of multiple items, but I'm just going to essentially just referring to the first one that I find. So that is a kind of a corner case, but I'm hoping that maybe we can solve that in a different way. But now I could just iterate through the list, and that's what I was doing originally. Instead of passing this query, we could just grab all projects, iterate through it, and then determine if we have duplicates and so forth. But that's a little bit extra work that I think is unnecessary for most use cases. So anyway, we define the project ID if the name was defined already in the JSON that we got back. If it was not there, then we create the project as you see here. So if the project ID is undefined, then we'll go ahead and create the project. And then if we've created it, then we set the project ID here. And that's pretty much it. We start over with project user, and you'll notice that the format is in fact, it is identical, because I was able to copy that block of tasks, paste it, and then just do a search and replace within that block and replace project with user. And it was directly usable. Instead of projects, we have users. I've got, in my case, I had user name, so that was a slight difference I had to make. But for the most part, I'm doing the same repetitive tasks over and over. I'm checking to see if the object exists. If not, I create it, set the IDs, and move on. So that's pretty much it. Now, this could be broken down into maybe a role or maybe multiple plays that get included. But as it stands, what we saw here is about 750 lines of code. Some of those are variables. A lot of those are repetitive. So it probably makes sense to put these into modules. But in this case, working with the API makes these actions extremely efficient, extremely fast. In fact, I'll run this one more time, and I'm going to enable debug. So that way we can see what the actual payloads look like. And you'll see, again, it's very quick to run through all of these tasks as both admin and the user, and look at the debug output. So this is very helpful. One last tip I would have is if you are trying to build API commands like this, the syntax reference from OpenStack API is good. It's a good start. It's not complete. There's a lot of things, for example, the queries that you see here, like this ports device owner equals, that's not documented. I just tried various things. The other thing you can do is you could tail the Neutron logs as you're making different actions in the UI, and you can see those happen in the logs themselves. You can see the different puts and posts and gets, and a combination of that plus the syntax will help you get to what you need. All right, hope this was helpful.